Welcome to The Debate. You smile at your boss when he insults you. You nod when you are disrespected. You swallow your anger every single day to keep the peace. But where does all that anger go? Tonight, we explore the horror of the werewolf complex and the terrifying reality of the monster growing inside every man who suffers in silence.
Yeah, it is a profoundly unsettling topic today. We are drawing from source material that looks at the classic werewolf folklore, but not just as some, supernatural myth.
Right, not just a ghost story.
Exactly. It looks at it as a dark psychological metaphor for suppressed male rage. The myth where a polite, well-behaved man turns into a savage beast under the full moon.
And the central question we are unpacking is whether modern society's demand for men to just, endure immense financial and emotional pressure in silence represents essential civilizing self-control, or does it inevitably create a catastrophic psychological mutation?
Right.
I will be arguing that maintaining this cage of stoicism, this civilized suppression, is the necessary, heroic burden of being a man.
And I will argue from the clinical psychology perspective that this relentless emotional suppression is basically a ticking time bomb, one that mutates into devastating rage.
Well, let's get into it then.
Gladly, because the clinical reality is that human psychology just cannot sustain perpetual suppression without severe consequences.
Well,
the idea that a man can simply lock away his most visceral reactions forever, and that those reactions just, vanish into thin air, is a really dangerous illusion.
I see the clinical framework you are building there. But let's look at the practical reality for a second. That illusion is actually the bedrock of our society. Self-control is the very definition of being a civilized man.
Sure, but at what cost?
At the cost of maintaining order. Our source material points to this archetype, right? The polite, well-behaved man who acts as the compliant good guy at work and at home. I argue that this is an achievement, not a tragedy. We live in a highly demanding world.
Yeah, we definitely do.
Men are expected to endure immense financial pressure, provide for their families, and navigate professional hierarchies. And doing that almost entirely relies on their ability to swallow their pride. Doing so in silence is a virtue. Letting your raw, unvarnished anger out every time you feel exhausted is weak.
I have to jump in here, because you paint a very noble picture of the quiet, compliant guy carrying the weight of the world. And culturally, yeah, we do revere that archetype.
Because it works. It keeps things from falling apart.
But from a psychological standpoint, the interpretation you just laid out is exactly what has corrupted the ancient philosophy of Stoicism into pure, toxic emotional suppression. True Stoicism is about managing your internal reaction to external events. It is not about pretending the reaction doesn't exist.
I wouldn't say they pretend it doesn't exist.
But they do. They box it up, and the source material is very clear on the clinical perspective here. Psychological trauma dictates that suppressed emotions do not simply disappear. They mutate. You cannot just box up exhaustion, disrespect, and profound frustration and expect it to evaporate into the ether because you willed it to.
Wait, before we go further, you keep saying the emotion mutates. Emotion isn't a virus, It's a feeling. So what does that actually mean in practice?
I'm glad you asked that.
How does swallowing a passive-aggressive comment from a boss during a Tuesday morning meeting biologically or psychologically mutate into this savage beast we are talking about?
That is exactly the mechanism we need to look at. When you swallow an insult, your brain doesn't just delete it. It rehearses it.
Oh, like lying awake at night.
Precisely. You lie awake at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scenario, thinking of what you should have said. And every single time you do that, you are firing up your amygdala and strengthening the neural pathways of that rage. You aren't suppressing the anger, you are actively training it in the dark.
Training it. That's an intense way to frame it.
It is. And this is what Carl Jung referred to when he talked about the shadow. The werewolf complex isn't just a poetic phrase. It is a metaphor for shadow projection. Every unacceptable emotion you refuse to process consciously gets shoved into the unconscious shadow.
Right.
And because it is starved of light and rational processing, it becomes feral. It ferments. It turns into chronic cortisol spikes, depression,
and ultimately a highly reactive aggression that is entirely disconnected from the original trigger.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on this. Isn't that just the price of admission for adulthood? You mentioned the shadow and the neural pathways, but let's look at the alternative. Acting as the compliant, agreeable good guy is precisely what keeps the machinery of society functioning.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Let me finish this thought. Think of the suppression of anger like a massive concrete dam holding back a violent, churning river. If every man decided that he needed to process his shadow and unleashed his anger whenever he faced disrespect, civil society would flood and collapse overnight. We rely on that dam.
But a dam without a release valve doesn't just hold water infinitely, it shatters. Let me tell you why. Emotional suppression is like paying the minimums on a high-interest psychological debt. You think you're managing it because the collectors aren't at your door today.
Well, they aren't at your door today because you are being responsible.
No, you're just delaying the inevitable. The interest is compounding, and eventually the principal balance comes due, and it bankrupts your entire personality. The hardest working, most suppressed men, the ones holding their breath to be the perfect provider, building that dam thicker and thicker, are the ones carrying the highest debt. And when that dam shatters, it doesn't just flood the valley gently, it obliterates it.
Let's ground this, though, because we are using words like obliterate and savage beast. For the listener, what does this actually look like? Are we talking about a man throwing a chair through a window at work?
No, actually.
Because that is extremely rare. Most men maintain the dam their entire lives.
It rarely looks like a cinematic explosion at the office, because the office is where the suppression is most heavily policed. The tragedy is that the beast usually gets unleashed exactly where the man feels safe enough to let his guard down.
At home.
Exactly. The beast isn't a monster destroying a village. It is the guy who snaps at his kids over a spilled glass of milk because his boss belittled him 8 hours earlier. It is the man who becomes completely emotionally frozen and alienated from his wife.
Just communicating in sharp sarcasms, right?
Yes, it's domestic volatility. The monster is just a man who has completely lost the capacity to regulate his nervous system. The tragic irony, as the text notes, is that this explosion destroys exactly what the good guy was silently suffering to protect. He swallowed his pride at work to provide for his family, only to bring a monster home that traumatizes that very family.
I don't disagree that the fallout is tragic. I really don't. But I am questioning the framing of it as an inevitability of the system rather than a failure of the individual. When we talk about the werewolf myth, the source material introduces the catalyst, right? The pressure of the full moon.
Right, the trigger.
By day, the man is normal. Under the full moon, he loses all control. I view the full moon not as a guarantee that the dam will break, but as the ultimate test of that structural integrity.
But the full moon isn't a test that you can pass just by trying harder. In this psychological metaphor, the full moon represents the metabolic breaking point. It's not a mystical event. It's a Tuesday night when the car breaks down, or a sudden unexpected bill arrives in the mail.
It's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Exactly. It hits an already overloaded system. The conscious mind, the prefrontal cortex which governs discipline and willpower, is incredibly fragile and resource-heavy. It requires rest and safety to function properly.
But the modern provider never gets that rest.
Never. He is under immense financial and emotional pressure constantly. Millions of men are walking around right now holding their breath, terrified of the beast they have created. So yes, the breaking point is inevitable, because the human nervous system is biologically finite. You cannot discipline your way out of exhaustion.
I still struggle with that logic because it completely strips the individual of his agency. You are describing this as a purely chemical reaction. Add enough stress, wait for the catalyst, and boom, the man turns into a monster. But is this transformation truly inevitable for every man who exercises stoicism?
Biologically, a breaking point exists for everyone.
But I argue that the true horror here is not the existence of the beast. We all have primitive aggressive instincts. The true horror is the failure of will. It is losing the strength to keep the cage closed. When a man destroys his life in a fit of suppressed rage, we shouldn't blame the concept of stoicism. We should recognize that his discipline failed him.
That assumes the cage was ever meant to hold a beast of that magnitude in the first place.
The traditionalist view demands that we maintain the cage, recognizing the beast is always there, but refusing to give it the keys.
It's like trying to cure a tumor through sheer willpower. Every time that man swallows an insult, every time he nods when he is disrespected, he isn't just ignoring the beast. He is feeding it raw, unprocessed psychological pain.
But he is doing it to survive in the professional world.
Sure, but the clinical reality is that this demand for absolute compliance creates an intolerable cognitive dissonance. The man knows he is being exploited, but his role as the provider demands he smile and say, "Yes, sir." That dissonance is the moonlight. It draws the beast out because the man's authentic self is starving.
But if the containment fails, what does that actually say about the man? Because the source material builds toward a very specific realization of terror here. The text states that the true horror of the modern male experience is the terrifying realization that there is a beast locked inside your mind, and you are slowly losing the strength to keep the cage closed.
It's a haunting passage.
It is, but I read that as a profound wake-up call. It is the moment of self-awareness where a man realizes the stakes of his own existence. Yes, the strength is waning. But that realization should be the catalyst for greater mental fortitude, for deeper self-control.
You're framing that as a victory of discipline, but I think you're misreading the psychological toll of that realization.
How so?
Well, that's a compelling argument. But have you considered that the terror stems precisely from the realization that the traditionalist approach you are advocating for has fundamentally failed? The horror isn't just, "Oh no, I'm losing my strength, I need to push harder."
Then what is it?
The horror is the betrayal. It's the thought, I followed all the rules. I did everything society asked of me. I was polite, I worked 60-hour weeks. I swallowed my pride to be the good guy. And my reward is a monster inside my head that wants to tear my life apart.
That implies the social contract itself is a trap.
It is a trap. The terror comes from the sudden, chilling understanding that the cage is inherently flawed.
Total containment is a myth. If you numb your outward expressions of distress to be the perfect provider, you are simultaneously breeding an uncontrollable rage in the dark.
Okay, let's follow that logic. If the cage is a myth, what is the alternative? Let the beast roam free?
No, of course not. Let's go back to the workplace. If every slight, every microaggression, every moment of financial anxiety is expressed outwardly, society crumbles into chaos. The workplace becomes an impossible battleground. Marriages dissolve into shouting matches over every minor friction.
You're jumping to extremes.
I'm really not. The reason men build the cage in the first place is because the alternative, unfettered emotional reactivity, is incompatible with civilization. You say the cage is a maximum security prison. I say it is the only thing standing between order and anarchy. It may be terrifying to realize you are losing the strength to hold the door shut, but that doesn't mean you let go of the door. You brace your feet and push harder.
And that push harder mentality is exactly how you create the werewolf. The alternative isn't anarchy. This is a false dichotomy that society feeds men to keep them compliant. Either you are perfectly silent, or you are a destructive monster.
Well, those are often the only two paths society accepts.
But the actual alternative is processing the emotion before it mutates. It's acknowledging the disrespect in real time, establishing boundaries, and finding the release valve before the dam shatters.
But society doesn't reward boundaries.
Exactly. Society doesn't reward that at all. Society rewards the man who says, "No problem, I'll get it done," while literally dying inside. The corporate structure, the economic realities of providing, they all incentivize the suppression.
It is a very bleak diagnostic. Let's dig into the reality of trying to establish those boundaries, though. Because if a man pushes back at work, he risks his livelihood. If he brings his unvarnished frustrations home, he risks burdening his family.
Right.
The Stoic ideal isn't just about protecting society. It's about protecting the people you love from your own stress.
But does it actually protect them? That is the crux of the werewolf metaphor. By day, he thinks he is protecting his village by being a mild-mannered man. But because he refuses to acknowledge what is happening beneath the surface, the transformation happens anyway, and the people he loves are the ones who get bitten.
That's a grim reality to face.
You cannot protect your family from your shadow by just ignoring it. It leaks out in your tone of voice, in your physical distance. Wives feel it when a husband is completely disconnected. The suppression doesn't protect the family, it just changes the damage from an acute explosion to a slow, chronic withering.
Well, I think we are arriving at a deeply uncomfortable convergence in our understanding of the material here. Because regardless of whether one views the suppression of anger as a noble, necessary sacrifice, as I do,
Or as a dangerous, toxic mutation, as I do.
right, we both must acknowledge the chilling realization at the core of this debate. The central tension of the werewolf complex remains true for both of us. The harder a man tries to be the perfect, polite provider while suffering his indignations in silence, the larger the shadow grows.
Exactly. We are looking at a systemic psychological crisis here. The weight of modern expectations, the economic demands, the social conditioning is acting as a massive stressor. The cage is literally breaking under that weight.
To summarize my stance briefly, I maintain that the heavy burden of modern manhood undeniably requires keeping that cage locked. The stoic endurance of financial and emotional pressure remains the most viable way to protect one's career and family. The horror of losing one's strength is real, but it must be met with renewed discipline. The dam has to hold.
And my position remains that treating the human psyche like a vault is a fatal error. Emotional suppression does not preserve order, it merely delays and amplifies eventual chaos. The tragedy of the werewolf is that he thought he could contain his nature indefinitely, only to find that the containment itself is what made him monstrous.
We leave it to you to weigh these perspectives. The reality of the pressure is undeniable, and the consequences of how we handle it define the course of our lives. Look in the mirror. You can only swallow so much poison before you start to bite. The moon is full. How long can you hold it in?